For a very long time, the origin of the woolly mammoth seemed almost settled. A large steppe mammoth moved into a colder world, ice advanced, selection did the rest, and out of that pressure emerged one of prehistory's most recognizable animals, furred, cold-hardened, perfectly built for the Pleistocene. It is a clean evolutionary story. Plausible. Efficient. Almost too efficient. Because two questions disturb it almost immediately. What if the woolly mammoth did not really begin where we thought it did? And what if the features that made it seem so uniquely Ice Age were already ancient by the time the animal itself appeared? Those questions lingered for years in the gap between bones and biology. Mammoth teeth, tusks, and skeletons could show size, shape, and movement across continents. But bones have limits. They can suggest ancestry without ever fully proving it. They can imply transformation while concealing the deeper structure beneath it. And for most of the history of mammoth research, that was enough. The accepted picture held because nothing older, more intimate, and more difficult to argue with had survived. Then scientists pulled DNA from mammoth teeth buried in Siberian permafrost for up to more than 1 million years. That alone was extraordinary. Ancient DNA is fragile under the best conditions. It breaks apart after death, splinters into shorter and shorter fragments, and is easily overwhelmed by contamination. By the time researchers examined these Siberian specimens, the surviving genetic material was shredded into tiny pieces. Yet from those fragments came something far more disruptive than a technical achievement. The DNA did not simply extend the mammoth timeline. It reorganized it. The 3 specimens at the center of this work came from different moments in the deep Pleistocene, one around 1.2 million years old, one around 1 million years old, and a later one roughly between 500,000 and 800,000 years old. Before their genomes were studied, they might have been placed, broadly and cautiously, among early mammoths near the steppe mammoth world that preceded the woolly mammoth. That part was not unreasonable. What the genomes showed, however, was that eastern Siberia was not home to one simple ancestral stream. It held at least 2 deeply distinct mammoth lineages. One of them would eventually lead to the woolly mammoth. The other belonged to a lineage so unexpected that it had not been clearly recognized before. It is often referred to by the name of one specimen, Krestovka. This is where the old certainty begins to collapse. Because the older story imagined a relatively straightforward transformation, steppe mammoth first, woolly mammoth later, with cold adaptation accumulating as the climate worsened. But the DNA suggested something less tidy and much more interesting. By roughly 1 million years ago, the branch leading toward woolly mammoths was already separate. The origins of the woolly mammoth, in other words, were not simply the last chapter of steppe mammoth evolution under worsening weather. They were part of a deeper and earlier split than many had assumed. And the second question, the one about what made a woolly mammoth truly woolly, became even harder to ignore. Researchers found that many of the genetic changes associated with woolly mammoth's cold adaptation were already present astonishingly early. Traits linked to surviving low temperatures, including some of the biological foundations for hair growth, fat metabolism, and thermal function, did not appear all at once in a dramatic late burst as glacier tightened their grip. Many were already established in older mammoths long before the classic woolly mammoth of popular imagination came into view. That means one of the defining myths about this animal begins to give way. The woolly mammoth was not simply forged, all at once, by the harshest Ice Age conditions. In important respects, it inherited a cold-weather toolkit from ancestors much older than itself. So the first of those 2 questions can now be answered. What if the woolly mammoth did not begin where we thought it did? It seems that its origin was not a clean threshold where a steppe mammoth suddenly became something new in response to ice. It was a long genomic prehistory, already underway more than 1 million years ago, in which the lineage that would produce woolly mammoths had started to separate well before the species reached its familiar form. But that was only half the revelation. Because once the ancient genomes exposed these 2 Siberian lineages, they also opened a second, larger mystery. If one lineage led toward woolly mammoths, what became of the other? The answer reached across Beringia and into North America. For generations, the Columbian mammoth was often treated as a kind of New World counterpart, larger, less shaggy, adapted to different landscapes, and usually understood as a separate branch. It fit the conventional tree well enough. Woolly mammoths in one place, Columbian mammoths in another. Different descendants of older mammoth stock. Distinct, if related. The DNA told a different story. The Columbian mammoth, it now appears, was not simply a sister lineage standing apart from woollies. Its ancestry was mixed. Genomic analyses suggested that it emerged from hybridization between the lineage related to woolly mammoths and that previously unrecognized Krestovka lineage. The estimated proportions were strikingly substantial, roughly 38 to 43% from the Krestovka-related line and about 57 to 62% from the woolly mammoth line. That is not a trivial exchange of genes at the margins. It is a profound redefinition of what a species can be. In other words, one of the great mammoths of North America may have originated through hybrid speciation, not a neat branching event, but a fusion. A lineage once hidden in Siberia, and another moving toward what we would later call woolly mammoths, met across the long rhythms of migration and climate. Out of that encounter came a mammoth no one could have fully understood from bones alone. Now the story is larger than mammoths. It becomes a story about how evolution really works when seen up close, and over immense spans of time. The older, textbook instinct is to imagine lineages dividing cleanly, each species replacing another like one page turning to the next. But the Pleistocene was not a clean page. It was a moving world of corridors, barriers, glacial pulses, and reopened roots. Population spread, separated, adapted, met again, and sometimes merged. The mammoth family tree was not only branching. At crucial moments, it braided. That matters because the woolly mammoth has often been treated as an icon of specialization, a perfect endpoint of Ice Age adaptation. But the DNA makes it feel less like an endpoint and more like a participant in a deeper experiment already running across the north. Its origins were older than its form. Its defining traits were inherited before they were perfected. And its closest giant relative in North America may have owed its existence to a genetic reunion between branches long separated. The creature on museum murals begins to change under that light. It is no longer enough to picture a woolly mammoth as a furry elephant built by cold. That image is too static, too finished. The real animal now seems to emerge from a much older genetic landscape, one in which identity was assembled gradually, and in which the line between separate species could become unexpectedly porous. And this brings us back to the second question. What if the traits that made the woolly mammoth seem uniquely Ice Age were already ancient by the time the species itself appeared? That, too, now has an answer. Many of those adaptations were inherited from earlier mammoths living hundreds of thousands of years before the classic woolly mammoth. Even at the level of important protein coding changes tied to cold adaptation, the majority were already present deep in the lineage's past. The cold did not create the woolly mammoth from nothing. It refined an inheritance that had been accumulating for ages. That changes the meaning of origin. Origin, in this case, is not a birth scene. Not a single evolutionary moment when the curtains part and the woolly mammoth steps onto the